I'm Matt, and that is my garage. Today, continuing to build on the 79. Actually, so this is the first video. This is part 3. You guys saw the teardown, and today, I've been working pretty hard on getting the parts in and starting to put this thing back together again, and I've made some really good progress I want to share with you guys today. And actually, I have so many things I've been working on. I had to figure out, like, what am I going to put in this first video? So I decided I'm going to go with the tank install, which makes sense because that's one of the first things I did. And then I'm going to jump over to electrical and show you what the wiring harness looked like coming out of the car and all the upgrades I've made to the electrical and some of the additions I've made in the back of the car. You'll see that I've done more when you see this footage of the electrical, but I'm probably going to touch on in the next video things like fuel delivery and beginning to put the suspension back together again, and the motor is well on its way to being rebuilt. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot's been going on. So let's start today with looking at those gas tank installs, and then let's touch on some wiring and see what improvements we can make. And I feel bad, I haven't really given an update on the 88, that one right there. I think the only videos I really made on that were the engine rebuild. But the car's been coming together nicely. It's basically turned into like a full nut and bolt. Like everything on the car, everything has been taken apart, rebuilt. So I've got some cool videos on that I really need to get into an update on the 88. So hopefully I'll have time to pull that together and get that posted pretty soon. But man, time has been tight. It's like I'm pulled in so many different directions. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get into the 79 and see what that's looking like. Tanks are finished, pressure tested, coated on the inside, sealed on the outside. Actually, it's the sun's hitting this just right. You can see the inside of the tank. It's in good condition. Bottoms of the tank, got all the rust off, coated those things in POR 15, so they should last a long time. And then for the mat that goes underneath it, now Lotus had that sponge type material, kind of looked like the underlayment from carpet, same kind of deal, but it was open cell and the water would get in there and just hold inside that mat and just rot away at the tanks. So the solution, because you still have to put something in there on the bottom for cushion, and then on the top, you want to put a pad on the top too, because when you put that wooden shelf on top of the tank, basically the pads at the bottom of the tank and the top of the tank are sandwiched in between the body and that top shelf, and that's what really gives that tank stability in there. So you got to go back with some type of padding. What I've done, I bought a yoga mat. It's good stuff. It's a 1/2 inch thick, so it's the same as the original, and it's closed cell foam, which means that it doesn't absorb moisture. You're doing yoga, you don't want all your sweat getting in the mat. You can actually buy a yoga mat for less than you can, say, a roll of closed cell foam. So yeah, after looking at the prices of just buying foam as it's advertised just as foam, I found yoga mats which had a lot more material for a lot less money than what I would have paid to buy advertised closed cell foam. So I'll be cutting that up to fit the tanks, and the tanks will be going in a couple minutes. was fun. Probably made it a little harder than it needed to be. But it's in, and that's a good feeling, because that means car's going back together again. Car's going back together again. So there we go. I got it bolted in down here. That also acts as a ground strap. And then filler tubes, vent tube. I want to get that rollover valve in probably before I do the vent tubes. Yeah, so I got a few more things to do. I gotta rivet this back in. Yeah, but I think now I'll do the tank on the other side. I spent some time back in the shed today making some new panels for the 79 S2. You can see them over there on the bench. All right, I got to show you what these old ones look like, man. They were toast. Here are the old ones. You can see as I kind of, the ends were just toast, man. The wood was just dry, falling apart. These had absolutely no life left in them whatsoever. But they were good enough to use as templates. So I cut new boards. Got the left and the right shelf there. I think that one goes in the back. The vacuum canister might be attached to that. And then these are the upper shelves, left and right. So I'm in the process of painting these right now. And after that, get them back in the car. They should be working a whole lot better than the old ones. So yeah, not doing mechanics today, doing woodwork. But hell, it's all part of it, right? All right, so as you can see, tanks are back in. I've got my new boards cut, and they're just kind of laying here right now. Got the tank in there, the pad on top. Since I put them in, I put the filler hose back on, and I am going to try to get a shot up where it connects to the bulkhead of the car, or the car. All right, up there. So the big hose next to the filler hose is the vent hose that goes to the tank. Those are new hoses. And then up there, that is that connects to the rollover valve. Now there's a little nipple that comes out, or connection on each filler tube, and you know, the original lines from Lotus have shattered on probably all cars. They were super brittle, and basically those were open to the air after those lines broke. So here's what's critical. If you're in my office, away from my real office. Now, I don't work on this thing full time. I actually do have a job, and I have to, I'm an engineer, and I have to, you know, I'm in the office a lot. But when I'm not, I'm working on this bad boy. I'm showing you now the wiring, and that's what I'm kind of focused on today. We can hit on some of this other stuff in a minute, but so here's what I want to do with the wiring. The way this thing came originally, it was one big wiring harness with no terminal connections or separate wiring harnesses. So you see it coming through the bulkhead there. Basically that, you know, octopused out into 4, 5, 6 different locations, but you couldn't really take one section of the harness off without taking, you know, pulling the whole thing out like this. So with the engine out, what I've decided to do is to cut in different harnesses with some really nice modern harness connectors. So I've already done that. I've pulled the taillight section out, and that's on my workbench, and I'm going through that, making sure all the wiring looks very good, replacing the brittle lines if there are any. And then I'm going to come back in up there, right through there. I'll put a big harness terminal connector. The way this thing was set up, they had, I'm going to try to reach in here, all these wires went to the starter. And they basically used the starter as a power distribution block. So all these wires were coming out of the bulkhead going to the starter. I am not going to put it back like that. I'm going to run these to a separate connection up there, which will be a power distribution block. I'll run the battery cables to that, and then from there I'll distribute to the car and then to the starter. So that'll clean up a lot of wires going to the starter. I really only want to have 2 wires to the starter, and And then I'm also going to cut out the engine wiring harness and put another terminal connector up there. Because the engine, you know, I can make a nice clean harness. There's only about 5 or 6 wires that go to the engine. So I want to declutter as much as I can, make this as simple as possible. I'll tell you, taking this thing apart, I have found so much crap that was shoddy work. As a matter of fact, the temperature sensor, there's usually a stainless steel pipe that goes up and over, and in there is a temperature sensor, and that's what tells the radiator fans to turn on, and it also controls the dummy light on the dash. Well, that wasn't even hooked up at all. Those wires are right here, and whoever worked on it previously, instead of buying a new auto switch, they said, screw it, we'll just connect them all together so the fans are always on. So that was their fix. So I'm cleaning up crap like this. That's not correct. But for now, that's where I'm at, and I'm gonna stop there because I still want to get some work done today on this thing, on the wiring harness, and we'll pick up at the next point. And I'm standing in the engine compartment. It's a little tight back here, so I don't know how it's gonna come out, but let's get started. Okay. Last video you saw I had the wiring harness out. Came out of the bulkhead right here. One big wiring harness, I had it laying down, basically connected to everything in the back of the car. So first things first, let's go with the simple one. I'm going to switch sides. Right here, coming out of the bulkhead, I separated the 2 wires for the fuel pump. These are right here. I've got a new harness connector on here that allows me to quickly disconnect the fuel pump when I need to. And then I've got some, I use these black mounting, basically they're for, you put a zip tie through it, and I can adhere those to the bulkhead of the car, run the wiring through those, and then just use the zip ties, and it gives me a really strong hold to the car without having to drill holes for insulated clamps or anything like that, or have to rivet anything. So I like these a lot, and I'll show you those in a minute, what I used. But the adhesive on the back of those is nowhere near strong enough to withstand the heat of the engine compartment and stay there for any length of time. So I use contact cement, and so what I do is I peel the backing off, and then on top of the sticky part, I'll put the contact cement, let it set up till it just gets tacky, and then adhere it to the bulkhead, or anywhere else I'm running wires. And it just, they're so good, they're so clean. I really like them. Anyway, so this little wiring harness runs down on that side to the fuel pump and wires the fuel pump. So that's all I have from electrical going to the driver's side of the car. So switch sides. Here's where it gets fun. Everything else in that wiring harness is kind of routed through the passenger side of the car. So, well, I guess if you're in England, it would be the driver's side of the car. Anyway, the right side of the car. How about that? So I take the main harness, and I've rewrapped all this, and I went in there and I've looked at the wires, and I wanted to make sure I had a really exact understanding of what every wire was, where it was coming from, and where it was going, because I think only then can you really design a new wiring harness going forward, where you don't have wires that are just hanging and not connected to anything. I spent a lot of time going through the wiring diagrams and making sure that I understood exactly how many amps were running through each wire, what voltage draw it was, etc. So I could really have a nice, modern, reliable, I always laugh when I say reliable and I'm standing in the back of a Lotus, reliable electrical system. So here we go, come out with the main harness, right? The very first thing that comes off that main harness is the wires to the actual engine itself. And I've got a nice little wiring harness connector here, which stubs right here. And so I have a completely separate harness for the engine, which is really cool because I can actually wire the engine on the engine stand and tuck those wires up underneath, make sure it's nice and clean, everything's the right length, new connectors, the whole 9 yards, drop that in the motor, and then it's just plug and play. So really like that. From there, the harness continues. The very next item that comes out of the harness is a group of ground wires. And those ground wires are grounded to the frame on this stud in the very closest to the bulkhead. And you've got about, there's probably 8 or 9 ground wires there. Pretty good gauge. They look like 14-ish gauge wires. So that comes out. I left that the same. Then the wiring harness continues. And the majority of the rest of the wiring harness goes to wire the taillight section. And then they have a bunch of power lines that carry power, 12-volt power, to the rest of the car. And these used to go directly to the starter. And it was really messy because there's there's about 8 wires that Lotus just used the starter as a power distribution block. And I mean, in theory, the same thing I'm doing, right? They're just pulling 12 volts, but they did it in a location that just wasn't clean and granted inexpensive, and that's what they were after, right? Just let's build the cars and get them out. But they didn't really spend any money on doing it a little better than they could have. It was kind of like good is good enough for them, which I get. You know, it's expensive manufacturing cars. So anyway, those are now all running into a power distribution block right here. And let's take that cover off. So what happens here is I've got a major 2-gauge wire on the top there, just under this lip, that runs through the bulkhead here, comes back onto the panel, and then makes its way to the battery location. So that feeds this power distribution. From there, it powers all the 12 volts that go to the front of the car. And I've got a lead here that will go to the starter. That'll be my 12 volts to the starter, directly connected to the battery. And then I've also got another 12 volt lead coming in here. I run that to a relay. And here's where I've changed things up quite a bit. There are a couple miscellaneous items back here that were very important to the car. However, just get neglected over the years, and I think in a lot of Esprits, these things have been neglected. One, the flow lock valve. In this car, it wasn't even there anymore. The flow lock valve is, in case you're in an accident, what happens is the inertia switch, which this is a new one, is triggered by knocking it, and that cuts off the power to the fuel pump, and it also closes the flow lock valve, stopping fuel flow to the engine. So it just kind of traps it into the system wherever it was at that point. And then the other item that was running us off some wires back here was the blower that takes cold air and blows it into the intake. So a couple things. Going back to this main, I've got a 10 gauge wire here going from the power distribution block to a relay. Probably didn't need to be 10 gauge, right? Could have been a lot smaller because it's the relay that bumps up the juice and then carries it to the rest of the car. But anyway, from that relay is triggered. Let me start with this. The inertia switch is wired directly to the ignition. So the ignition wire comes up. So when your ignition's in the on position, comes up and is wired to this inertia switch. And as long as that switch is in the open position, then 12 volts continues to flow out the other side and power those items I was just talking about. However, 12 volts for me wasn't really good enough to power what I wanted to power, so I take that 12 volts out of the inertia switch and I run that into the relay as my trigger switch. So the relay, as long as this is open, the relay is getting that 12 volts and it's pumping up the juice, and then I run that power out of the relay directly into a fuse box over here. And the reason I did a fuse box is because, you know, I do have a lot of new items back here that I want to have direct access to the fuses, and I want to make sure that the amperage is correct for each one of those fuses, and that I'm using the right gauge to power the new items back here. So on its way to the fuse box, it runs through a 30 amp breaker. Now, a breaker is the same thing as a fuse, except when it blows, you don't have to replace the fuse, you just have to reset the breaker. So they're great. I mean, auto manufacturers don't use them because they're big, they take a lot of space, and they're a lot more expensive than a fuse. But I like it because now I can quickly see if something goes wrong in any part of this circuit, that's going to trigger, and it's going to cut off juice to everything back here that I don't want to fry. So I've got that prior to the fuse box. So anyway, power comes into the fuse box, and I've got 3 circuits running off the fuse box. I've got the blower, which is here, taking cold air from outside into the engine. My flow lock valve is now connected to the fuse box here, so I can change fuses on the flow lock very easily. This is the flow lock valve here. It's in the fuel line. And like I said, if the inertia switch is triggered, this will shut off flow to the carburetors. So, you know, safety and for me, I'm really worried about fuel delivery and I'm worried about electrical. I want those both to be very safe using the most current technology that I can for this car. So I don't have to worry about fuel leaks and, you know, fires, heaven forbid. And then the other circuit I have coming off here is the fuel pump, 15 amp fuse. But I relocated that and I've got a 15 amp fuse here now running to that. The blower takes a 15 amp fuse. So this blower, the old one, the motor was completely toast. It had fried. It had a short, all the wires were melted, and the motor itself, you couldn't even turn it. Even with vice grips, I couldn't turn the motor. So I have a new blower back here, and it fits perfectly, but this baby blows over 300 CFM a minute, cubic feet per minute. That's a lot of air. It's pulling it directly from the air scoop outside, and it's blowing that into the motor. And you know, I got to pause there, gripe about something. So many Lotus Esprits, especially the early ones, a lot of them I see, the airbox is gone, and you know, they're running these K&N little air filters right on the carburetors, and they look okay, but they're pulling hot air that's been recirculating in the engine compartment back into the motor. And hot air is not good for performance. You don't want stagnant hot air being pulled into your carburetors. This baby's going to blow 300 CFM, cubic feet of air, into the motor every minute. That's a lot of air. So essentially, this is forced induction. It's kind of the same theory as like a supercharger or a turbocharger. You're bringing more air into the engine. Nowhere near as efficient as those two applications, but this is greatly improved over the original. The original was not pumping anywhere near this much air, and like I said, this car didn't have an airbox, blower didn't work, so none of that system was hooked up at all. So I've got that hooked up again, 15 amp fuse. This is a 4-inch inlet and outlet. The pipe that comes from the inlet on the ear scoop on the outside is a 3-inch. So I've had to make a little adapter that goes from 3-inch to 4-inch. Well, I didn't make it, I just bought it, right? They're pretty common. So I got that in the system, so I jump up to 3 to 4. In here I'll go from 4 back down to 3 as it comes into the airbox. Running to the fuse box, I've got a major ground wire, and that's pulling from right here. And I ran the ground from the battery to this post here. Nice big 2-gauge wire. And then I've got this one just kind of hanging out. This wasn't part of the original design of Lotus. This is going to ground the engine block. And so the way they grounded the engine block, over on the left side of the car, the gas tanks have a ground wire. There's a bolt that holds the gas tank to the chassis, and then there's a ground wire attached to that. It's more of like a ground strap. And then that attaches to the chassis in a location on either side. And that's great, but in the past, I've found that that ground just wasn't good enough, and I was having some electrical gremlins in some of my other Lotuses because of that poor ground. So I was really conscious this time about, I want really, really strong grounds everywhere, right? Because having a bad ground, man, all kinds of crap can go wrong with your car. And then you're chasing it, scratching your head. It can be very, very frustrating. So I've got this new, I think this is a 4-gauge wire, which will go from the battery ground post here on the frame, and that'll connect right to my engine block, giving me really good ground. And I'm also using the straps on the gas tanks. So not taking any chances. I'd rather overground than underground. You see a lot of other stuff that's happened here. I don't want to talk about it just yet because I want to handle them as systems, right? We're talking about electrical system now. And The last thing that is part of this wiring harness that comes through here is the wiring harness that goes to the rear taillight section. And I've separated that. And I've got a nice wiring harness connector here, and you know it connects right in here under this board, and then this harness is now independent. Will run to the back lights, so I can take this to the workbench, and I'll give you an example like here are the wires for the license plate lights. So I'm going to put new connectors on here, clean this up, and then these ends are what feed the tail lights. Now I'm going to make a nice clean harness connector here that will plug right in to the tail lights on either side, so I can unplug those as I need to, and I know that the wiring is exactly how it should be for this system. So in terms of wiring, that's pretty much it. That's kind of it for right here. I think the wiring is really good, so let me show you what else I've been doing.